Hello, everyone. Salim Barahmi here, Director of PIPD. I want to welcome you to another episode of Dardashe, a series where we talk at length with amazing and inspiring Palestinians about their lives and the work they do. Today, we're joined by Noura Erakat, a scholar, human rights attorney, and an activist. Noura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
How are you holding up in these crazy
We're very
times?
lucky. We're very blessed. I'm a salaried employee, which means I don't have the anxiety of either being in some sort of precarious situation or the necessity of putting myself at risk on a daily basis. So on that level, very, very lucky. I also am the mama of a school-aged child, and that's the greatest challenge. I'm teaching her now.
Oh, wow.
And really, it's just stressful for both me and her.
I wanted to take it back. I wanted to ask you kind of what were your earliest memories?
My grandfather and great uncles had immigrated in even well before 1970 when my father immigrated there. And so I grew up in a very Palestinian environment because I grew up not without the pressures of assimilation, and without this feeling of not being Arab or distant. I actually grew up with a lot of family. Like all our parties were azayim and weddings and cultural norms that were instilled in us. My first language was Arabic. America is based on a white supremacist culture, which we are encouraged to assimilate into, and I didn't have that pressure. When you talk about what are your earliest memories, I have 3 brothers who are amazing.
Older or younger?
Well, so here's how it goes. I'm actually the second, but I'm an Irish twin, which means I'm born within a year of my eldest brother.
Okay.
So it meant that I had none of the privileges of being the eldest, right? But the responsibility of being the eldest.
Yeah.
Because I'm the girl. So my earliest memories were actually what it was like to grow up as a girl. And my first struggles were not struggles as a Palestinian or as, a minority, a racial minority in the United States. My first struggles were as a woman and as a girl. If you have sisters or cousins or aunties, the ones that they all went through, right? This expectation that somehow we were responsible for all things that had to do with the home and the private sphere of maintaining it and reproducing the conditions of living and comfort that are, the invisible and, gendered unpaid work, the dishes after dinner, the setting up, right? At the same time that the public space was marked as dangerous for me, as for other girls, because that's where, girls as embodiments of the family's honor was at risk. So the only way to reduce that risk is to keep us inside. Here I was, the one that was more responsible than them, had earned it because of the work that I did, and then didn't get to do those things.
How would you push back? How would you navigate that?
You should have my brothers on and ask them. Definitely, or maybe have my mom. What?
We'll poll them later.
Haram. I mean, I fought all the time. I talked, thinking that I could talk my way out of it. I wrote letters to my parents, and then I protested, and I remember one of my protests, I turned a broom upside down and just marched around the house of hell no, I won't clean. Hell no, I won't clean. Which began, precipitated a barrage of bawabij.
Of course.
And, for my mom, she just needed help. She didn't see this as, a point of unfairness. She saw me as helping her rightly. Like she was doing everything. So she was pursuing her college education and fully taking care of the house and helping my father, with our small business. So, we have to keep in mind that the conditions that I grow up in are not one of oppression. There's a structural situation. Mama was responding to it. She needed my help. And this is how she knew to get help. Anyway, the result of my protest is that my brothers were each given chores.
Nice.
And I got to go out, my privileges in the public sphere expanded incrementally. But a lot of it happened against my parents' will, which is really hard for young Arab women.
Was there a moment in your life or an event that to you marked a turning point in that regard, where you felt those expectations or those gender norms weren't placed on you as much?
So the turning point is that, just initial awakening. And mind you, that it was also normalized for me because all the other girls that I knew were doing the same thing.
Yeah.
I just happened to be the most resistant to it.
Sure.
Right. And, that comes with great cost.
Mm-hmm.
And it came with reputational cost. The one thing that gave me space and the safety to break the rules, and for a young girl in an Arab Muslim community, comes at a high cost. That reputation is a very big deal. Everything about your self-worth rides on it, and your family. And so the one thing that gave me space to break those rules was education and school. I loved school. And so it would be the way that people made excuses for me. إنه معلش ما هي شاطرة. So it was like the one, and later when I became really politically active, right? معلش ما هي وطنية أو نشيطة سياسية. You know what it is? So there was always that, there was always this discomfort. It was not pleasant.
Yeah,
it was not pleasant. I just left. I said, this is what I want. I want to go away. I want to live in the dorms. That's a big deal.
Living in the dorms, I think, for Arab children, but especially then Arab women, live at home. You have everything.
You know what? And I did. I lived on the all-girls, unit and da-da-da-da-da. But it was also complicated because I grew up in Fremont and I went to Berkeley. I mean, for most people looking at this, I could have lived at home and commuted. And I say, and I emphasize this also, and I keep explaining why I talk about this. This is my core. This is where my core becomes constituted. In struggle, really, which is against, gendered norms, which are not fair and not natural, the high cost of, confronting those gendered norms. And then, it's so private for us because it's it's the internal space, it's the family space, it's the private space. And as much as possible, I want to emphasize it because it both is, exactly who we are. And the message I send to young girls, I see all the time. When I look around our movement, it's women, it's young girls who are leading us fervently, right? And yet when you look at our leadership, that's not who's, that's not, or our experts or, whatever else, it's the rarity. What is that?
I wanted to ask you, growing up, did you visit Palestine? Were you able to come?
Oh, I thought you were going to say, did you cook? I was going to be like, that's the one thing. I clean, mama cooked. When I was young. So this is also connected to the story.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, what was that experience like?
We go to Palestine, and Abu Dis and Jericho, and that's where my family is, and that's like the first time, and it's very much a family trip, and it's just full of love and cousins and fun and food. The second time after that, I started begging my family to live there. Partner around restricting my movement as a girl and as first generation immigrants in the United States was, wanting to protect me from the rest of the world. But then when I looked in Palestine and I saw my cousins and the way that they were out, in Riha, they would be out, they would be with their friends, they would, they can be in places, there was trust there. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I can actually be more free in Palestine. I begged my family to send me to the Friends School in Ramallah, right? I thought, I need, it never happened. But I traveled by myself with my amti, my father's sister, and my favorite uncle, her husband, Ami Abu Wa'el. I traveled with them by myself at age 14. And at age 14, now I'm going and I can actually see certain things. Now I'm noticing, right? I have a blue passport. So I notice economic disparity between where we are in the West Bank, and if we enter, West Jerusalem, right? Or if we go to Haifa or anywhere else. And those, it's starting to crystallize for me that this isn't natural, just as my gendered expectations as a girl, we're not natural, but constructed. So too was this acute poverty and distinct circumstances were not natural. I was searched, at the border at 14. I was interrogated. I mean, those things you register as being not natural. So then I go again alone at age 18. I go at 16 with the whole family. I would just continue to visit, right? But at age 18, I lied to my family. I got a scholarship they didn't know about, and I used it to go to Palestine, to in refugee camps. I used the money to basically go and teach English to young Palestinians at the Hisha refugee camp who were going to come on tour, a national tour in the United States for, that cultural troop. That was the most formative experience. My politics were geared, very internationally focused. I was politicized in the sense that, I had aspirations. I wanted to be the Secretary of State of the United States. I thought that, the world was unjust and unfair for every, I already had a racial analysis. I had not necessarily a class analysis, but, just I could see injustice. I saw inequity very, very starkly. It was just gut wrenching, and I don't want to fetishize anyone or anything, so I won't go through them because they might be taken out of context, but those images are still stick with me of when I, came back to the US. I was a freshman in college, and I came back, and I just was never the same again. My parents wanted us to be culturally Palestinians, but not politically involved. So it's a rare story where they're not the ones showing me keys and telling me stories, and so this is also tension with my family that this is what I want to do.
Do you think it's a generational thing?
It definitely, that's true, but the other part is true. I know a lot of young people whose families instilled it in them, whose stories of Palestine and consciousness around Palestine is something their fathers, their mothers, their that it's instilled in them. And so in some families, for example, there's many families that don't speak Arabic to their kids.
Yeah.
Because they want to start anew. And my family spoke Arabic to us a lot and instilled the cultural norms. They sacrificed everything to start something new. Why would I not be making good on that sacrifice to just move on? Right? But it was that trip where I got back and thought to myself, there's a lot of people to work on a lot of issues all over the world. There's so few people that work on Palestine. So I want to do it.
I grew up in Palestine when I was 18 to the US, and one of the piece of advice, so politics was always in the family, but it wasn't, as you say, the stories, etc. We just grew up under occupation. So that was something it naturally shapes you and your formative experiences and years. But my parents told me, when you go to the US, don't talk about politics. Go study, right? And I didn't really understand that back then when I was 18. I got a sense of, what they meant, but then I became, I think, even more political with time being there, because it in a way, it brings it out of you. You feel that your voice and your story has not been told or hasn't been heard, and you feel that you need to compensate for that. So it puts you into overdrive in a way. Is that what led you to law school eventually? Yeah.
1000%. That was, so now mind you, this is now 18. There's also, it's the height of the sanctions regime against Iraq. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in regards to injustice in the Middle East beyond Palestine, right? This is 1998. And I, was very lucky and fortunate. I had activist elders to nurture and teach me. And they were, folks that were organizing themselves in the American Anti-Discrimination Committee San Francisco chapter, which gets excommunicated from the larger ADC because we're too radical. There are also, formations of really radical women, the Arab Women Solidarity Association. So I'm so lucky. Found a vibrant political community to enter into and to support, even though on campus, we still hadn't organized ourselves effectively, right? We had some things here, but we hadn't organized ourselves. In 2000, I'm a junior in college, and I want to study abroad, and I want to study in Palestine, but Berkeley won't let me study at Birzeit. They won't let me study at any Palestinian university, okay? ولا بتلحم ولا محل. They think it's dangerous for their American students. And so,
do we have a visitor?
We have a little one. Mama, you want to say hi?
She can join if she wants.
What? That's Salim.
Do you get good grades from Mama?
Yeah.
That's good.
Mama.
1 second, Salim. Okay, guys. Welcome to... That's what she wanted to do.
Which is?
That thumb.
We didn't see it. I didn't see it.
You don't see a thumbs up?
No.
What?
Where were
Palestine. So I go to study. They won't let me study abroad in a Palestinian university. They think that's too dangerous for their students, which of course is super problematic.
Yeah.
I end up enrolling at Hebrew U.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I'm supposed to be there for the year. I basically make it through the Ulpan, which is the Hebrew language immersive program. And I was already studying Hebrew at Berkeley as a language requirement. And then the Intifada starts, the Al-Aqsa Intifada starts, and I'm there. And I'm there. And that catalyzed and catapulted me onto the trajectory that I remain on politically. Although I have to say that for so many other young people, it might have been for me, it was that moment. For other people that are younger, it was the attack on the Mavi Marmara in the Gaza flotilla. For others, it was, Operation, the various Israeli offensive against Gaza, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014. All of these are very politicizing moments. For me, I happened to be in Palestine when the Intifada started, and one of the first people killed, there were 5 people killed at the Haram al-Sharif on September 20th, 2000. And he was my neighbor in Abu Dis.
Oh, wow.
And so that, those things stick with you. Images of his family and his daughter at the time, the Aza, then what became the curfews that were imposed, living under that curfew, and also being a young person and wanting to figure out, wanting to be a part of it. And I was traveling. I traveled when we weren't supposed to travel. I went to Ramallah. I was collecting stories from the families of those who of martyrs, of those who were being killed in the course of the Intifada, and I was collecting those stories to document them in an oral history project. And so that's why I was traveling. I wasn't just randomly moving around, but I was going to Jerusalem alone. I was going to Turmasaya. I was going to Ramallah. I was in Ramallah when Israel destroyed through military, Air Force, right, launched missiles and destroyed the Palestinian police department, where Palestinians had killed 2 Israeli soldiers. And during that time when I was doing that travel, and I was doing it alone as a girl, and this, constantly becomes part of the story, phone lines would be down, and my Palestinian family wouldn't know where I was. And, wanted me out of Palestine. They didn't want the responsibility for me. They didn't want to be responsible for, this Palestinian from the United States who could not be controlled and wouldn't stay indoors and was, anyway, they didn't want me there. Hebrew University wanted me to stay put. They wanted me to actually move to the dorms in Hebrew U and leave the West, leave Abu Dis, and I wouldn't. And then I was organized, I was doing some activism on campus. It was, it was just a confluence of different things. My family was worried in the US. My family in Palestine didn't want me because I wouldn't, and the university was stressed out and wanted me to sign waivers that they weren't responsible for my life or limb. And ultimately I came back to the US in December, in the beginning of it, and I hid at home. I didn't want anyone to know that I was back. I had a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt that I could leave when others couldn't leave. And I just kept hoping that I would get to go back ASAP. And I didn't get to go back. And instead threw myself into organizing with the ADC and with what emerges as the Students for Justice in Palestine on the UC Berkeley campus. And, you know, in that begins a wave of activism where we launch divestment from apartheid Israel in February 2001 upon the re-election, the second time, of Ariel Sharon for prime minister. And, you know, then our whole life becomes about, the rest of my college career is literally about organizing on campus and divestment from Israel and helping other students do it across the country. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I mean, I remember that time. I mean, yeah, those were my formative years. Those were my teenage years in the Second Father. I noticed you said apartheid Israel. Was that discourse something that you as Palestinians in the US had adopted back then already?
Well, it wasn't pervasive.
Yeah.
It wasn't pervasive, but certainly I had, you know, in organizing with people in the ADC, organizers in the ADC, I remember sitting in a comrade's living room and talking about it. And I remember saying very clearly, this is the moment where we have to borrow from South Africa. We have to borrow, you know, if we borrow these tactics, this is about Israel having to defend itself and not us having to make the case, right? And so we were really clear that we were borrowing from the South African model and that we were applying, you know, a discourse of racialized, you know, oppression and distinction. And when we unfurled the banner on February 6, 2001, in Sather Gate, it literally said, divest from apartheid Israel. It hadn't become the norm in any Palestinian discourse. It certainly wasn't the norm among legal scholars yet, right? This is 2001.
Yeah, but I mean, it caught my attention because it was extremely early. I think it's just now starting to become normalized, I think, within public discourse. So
Although, you know, there were, you know, Palestinian scholars who were also articulating it as apartheid in 2000, because what was revealed in the course of the 7 years of the peace process between 1993 and 2000 is that Israel was not, you know, incrementally withdrawing from, you know, territories B and C as, you know, otherwise stipulated, but instead entrenching their control and had created different legal jurisdictions on fragmented lands. I mean, the definition of apartheid is that spatial and political distance with, you know, two, you know, characterized and articulated through law, distinguishing between two groups whereby one group is favored, right? We weren't borrowing from the Convention Against Apartheid of 1973. We were literally just, it was this, you know, analysis of, we see what's happening. This is the time to turn the tables. It's just time. It's time. And so we did it as activists. Now going back, I see that other scholars, and I write about, I cite this in my book, other scholars had been doing the same in 2000. A group of Palestinian academics who were able to say, this is looking like apartheid, not like peace. And then by 2005, the 170 civil society groups, when they launched the BDS call, are building on all of this, right? Are building on this organic development and work that had been happening, and basically transform it into an international legal campaign.
Yeah. The discourse on apartheid.
And just an international campaign, not necessarily legal.
Sure. Noted. The discourse on apartheid is is becoming the norm, but it seems to, I think, be much more popular amongst younger generations, younger Palestinians, and also a lot Palestinians abroad. And I think there's a certain generation within Palestine that is reluctant to accept it and take it on. And I think our leadership is also very guilty of that. And I think there is tied to that an element of a transition into a different paradigm, where we're leaving the reality of the Oslo paradigm that a lot of people have been attached to into something that is yet to be defined. And so there's a bit of fear there. And so I wanted to ask you, from what you see, why is the apartheid framing, why is the discourse around apartheid about civil rights, racial justice becoming much more popular amongst younger Palestinians and Palestinians around the world?
So this is such an interesting question for me, because it's 2020. That means 20 years since we actually used the language. As far as I'm concerned, it's been popular, right? I mean, as part of my work with the U.S. campaign, when I was a legal fellow there and a grassroots fellow, I worked on developing an anti-apartheid curriculum. How do you train trainers on how to use this framework? I've since seen it, being developed, very robustly as an analytical framework and scholarship and legal advocacy. It's been, when I was working with Badil, we established in 2012 in a submission to the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that Israel was in violation of Article 3 of the CERD, which basically describes a situation of apartheid, both within the West Bank as within, Israel proper. The ESQA, UN ESQA, in the report that was headed by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, make, I think, a damning, analysis and articulation of an apartheid regime over all Palestinians, including Palestinian refugees. So we, as far as I'm concerned, I've seen this grow and being seeped as an analytical framework, as a point of advocacy, as a, and a way of understanding the racialized logics of Israel's governance. So when you say what's the real, and the other thing is it's not necessarily Western, right? So, there could be a suggestion in the way that you ask the question, an implicit suggestion that this is exogenous to our Palestinian, work. And yet it was in 1975 when it was Palestinians, right, who incorporated a condemnation of Zionism alongside, apartheid in Resolution 3379, condemning Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. I'm just emphasizing that this isn't something imposed from the West onto Palestine. It's actually drawn from our own Palestinian traditions of understanding Israel as a racist government, right? And making the analogy to Palestine, to apartheid.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess my question is, it's reached a norm within Palestinian public discourse and society, I think internally, where I don't think it was 20 years ago. I don't think that's
fair. Yeah.
So it's shifted. It's come a long way, and it seems to be more popular with certain segments of our society than others, right? I mean, in Palestine, amongst
where do you see it? So as someone who I have my thoughts.
Sure.
But like,
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
But where are you seeing that? Where do you see it being used, and where do you see you say that the leadership is not using it?
I see there's a big reluctance from the leadership to pivot to a one-state apartheid framing and discourse and what that would entail. I see that conversation happening with certain segments of society here. I think within the NGO and civil society world, but not at mass. I lived abroad for 10 years. And so for Palestinians I met in the US and in the UK and in other places, I saw that discourse much more advanced, right? And now you're seeing an acceptance of that discourse and that framing more so than ever. So I was just wondering, where do you see, why is it moving in different directions in different places amongst different people.
I mean, it also reflects a certain reality of there's an absence of an analytical framework amongst our leadership altogether, right? They have used apartheid. They've said it. They've said it in their speeches. They've said it multiple times. They've said it as a threat. If Israel doesn't agree to a Palestinian state, then we're declaring, so they have said it. But what is the reluctance to actually using that framework and a different model outside, a statist approach, right? And the way that you're framing the question is less so about are Palestinians able to articulate their struggle as a racial one, and more so in terms of understanding it as, one state versus two state, where apartheid is the analogy for the one state, right? Or a euphemism for one state, and that approach. So, and I think so much of that is contingent on what has become a hegemonic approach to the question of Palestine, especially since 1988 and acutely since 1993, whereby the Palestinian struggle and our freedom is equivalent to establishing an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, right? And it's a commitment to that framework without assessment, without reflection. There's been no moment where we've stopped to evaluate, is this still what we want? That was declared and adopted as a framework at the 18th PNC in 1988. We haven't had any national discussion since then to reevaluate, where are we? Yeah. Is this still the way, and you want to think about Palestinian national thought has been evolving, has never stopped evolving, right? One of the biggest junctures was in 1968, when Palestinians declared their struggle as a national liberation movement, right? Before that, it was a derivative of a broader Arab nationalist cause. But in 1968, when Palestinian, armed groups, take over the PLO, which was otherwise at that point commandeered by Egypt and being led by Egypt. But when Palestinian armed groups take it over in 1968, and then issue and declare a vision for Palestine for a single democratic state, that was revolutionary. When in 1988, Palestinians then at the 18th PNC say, look, our liberation and our movement is going to be the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, right? Without foregoing any of our rights for refugees to return and so on and so forth. That is another and possibly even more radical, and Walid Khalidi argues this in an article written at the time, one of the most radical junctures in Palestinian thinking. The two-state solution is the most radical juncture in Palestinian national thought. The fact that now we see emerging very organically and crystallizing a return to the vision of a single democratic state is not, I wouldn't say is a radical return.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we agree.
Right. So it's actually part of, but it is a moment that is, merits, we have to continue to evolve, and we haven't. Yeah. And instead, we've been sitting on, we're sitting on a lot of crap, frankly.
Yeah. So, and this brings me to my next question. I think there is an evolution in Palestinian thinking in our political evolution with the time. But sometimes we're finding difficulty to have a home for these discussions, which used to be the PLO. Right? So, but at some point I feel like there's a stranglehold on the PLO, power dynamics between the PLO and the PA, being under a one-party rule in the West Bank and one-party rule in Gaza. We've lost our political system. And so the question is to come back to have these conversations within the 13 million Palestinians around the world. How do we do that?
Are we 13 million now?
Yeah.
So a few things on that, right? A few things on that. One is to say that, I just want to also explain, when I say we're sitting on a pile of crap, I just think we're sitting on unexamined accepted norms in Palestinian national thinking that merits some scrutiny,
Mm-hmm.
right? Wherever we come out at the other end. Like, and I say this all the time, that even if you're an avid two-stater,
Mm-hmm.
you have to at least know enough to know that the Oslo framework is in contravention to your ambitions to establish a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
So all of us should be in opposition to Oslo, regardless of what we believe the political outcome should be, right? The fact that we aren't unearthing that, and that the Palestinian, official leadership right now has boycotted these peace talks, but has not abandoned the United States, is a problem. They're just
Mm-hmm.
waiting for Trump to leave. They haven't decided this strategic course has brought us to a dead end. We have to pivot away at whatever cost and risk, right? That's what I mean by the crap. The other thing I want to highlight is that part of the problem with a framework of one state, of an apartheid analogy, and then what becomes this idea of equality, rubs a lot of Palestinians the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
Because it basically sounds like we want this, multicultural, plural democracy where citizenship and political sovereignty is the apex of our freedom, whereby we're just demanding equality with Israelis and Israeli settlers.
Mm-hmm.
That rubs a lot of Palestinians the wrong way, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm one of them. As much as we can't, talking about equality might just sound like we want to democratize a settler colony.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to decolonize the settler colony. So the fact that we don't have, what does it mean when we think together about what decolonization means? So how is it, in order to be resonant and not to come off as just this liberal, multicultural horizon, but is actually something that's, we Palestinians endure colonial conditions. Our response to that has to be an anti-colonial struggle, and not merely, a struggle for equality. So what does that look like? And that's, those are the conversations I think do happen and have happened a lot in scholarship, probably more so than in popular spaces, but also in popular spaces, we're being shown what it looks like, right? Weekly protests in Bil'in and Na'lin are part of the struggle of what that looks like. The popular protests against the building and the routes of the apartheid wall are part of that protest. The building of encampments, of Palestinian encampments in areas E1 are part of that popular discourse. The Great March of Return, which is an emphasis, not just to end the siege on Gaza, but the right to return, emphasizing that this requires some sort of decolonial, struggle in terms of liberating the land. Part of that movement. It exists. Palestinians who are engaging in what many would call indigenous resurgence, which is, how do you cultivate the land? What does the relationship to the land look like? What are our, seeds? What are our traditions? All of that is part of the, so yes, and so that brings me back to your point. So much of our emphasis is we want to have what we once had in the form of a PNC as this ultimate uniter, right? And there's the problem with that. The problem with that, one, is that we cannot look to the past to resuscitate what we had, because that was one, the PLO was never, not every group was in the PLO.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Right. Number two, it wasn't always democratic, and there's many fissures in that history. Number three, representation within it was also exclusionary, but the reason it was so successful is because it was comprised of very active Palestinian political parties that do not exist. So the whole idea of wanting to rebuild the PLO begins with rebuilding Palestinian political parties that can then be represented in the PLO, right? In the PNC, to have seats and representation. So you want to build this whole umbrella. Who's going to be in it? You're not in it. We can be in it as individuals who might represent, geographically, but we should be representing different forms of political thought that we can debate. To represent those forms of political thought, you have to organize yourself in political, units. If you don't want it to be a party, at least in political formations, social movements that stand for something. So when we talk about we want that, we have to think about, well, how do I form that now amongst like-minded Palestinians who might agree, right? So it's not that we lack a place to just have a discussion. It's a lack of initiative and amongst ourselves, and a space amongst ourselves to have those discussions.
No, I hear you. I think, so even if you form a political unit, a political party with like-minded that share the same political thinking, you still won't have access to a system that I think we do romanticize quite a lot. And so I think at some point there needs to be a nudge to that system to let us in, or to force our way in, or to be able to then gather the voices that are like-minded to engage in a and I think
1,000%, 1,000%. I don't disagree with you. And if you ask, actually, Mahmoud Abbas is also the chairman of the PLO.
He is. He has
and
many
if you
titles.
if you have this conversation with anybody in the leadership, right, they will disagree with you, because for them, they've added 300 members to the PNC. They've resuscitated it. They've had a change in leadership. It's ongoing. The PLO convenes, right? So as far as they're concerned, it's actually not stale. It's ongoing. But we would look at that and say, that's not what we wanted. So we have a choice. We can place our emphasis on taking that over from the inside out, which means we would have to, bid to be included and take that over from the inside out. We can also create an alternative.
And those are debates, very valid debates that are happening, right?
Yeah, we can. And I think that people have put their money where their mouth is in terms of creating alternatives, because we've seen a lot of great initiatives. In 2006 to at least 2010, I was part of one of those initiatives in the US, of the US Palestinian Community Network. The whole intention of it was, it was created in the context of the split between Fatah and Hamas, was to create some space for Palestinians, at least in the United States, to come together to be able to have these discussions. We did not, we had a lot of struggles, including the fact that when our group refused to condemn the ouster of Fatah from Gaza, because, we saw it as a counter coup, and we've seen a lot of scholarship. Actually, recently in the Journal of Palestine Studies, there's a great article that, demonstrates it's a counter coup. For a lot of people who are loyal to Fatah, they saw it as, as treason within the national movement. And so there was actually a splinter group of the USPCN that took all the work that we were doing together, created an alternative listserv, and tried to organize an alternative conference, the one that we were convening. I mean, even in the United States, we were not immune from these, internecine conflicts. But other efforts have also tried to do this. And, the Palestinian youth movement, in my opinion, is one of the most successful and one of the greatest models of what it looks like to build a social movement. And a social movement that is connecting Palestinian youth in a transnational framework, that wants to create an alternative, is developing political thought amongst their base, is, traveling together on study delegations, is organizing together, is bridging analyses from different geographic spaces of where Palestinians live. So we have models of that. We have models of that. But, the truth is that this is not, there isn't an easy way out of our condition.
Yeah.
There isn't an easy way out. We're really good at pointing at what the problem is. And I do agree that the Palestinian leadership is a core part of the problem. Not just because of what they, advocate for or fail to do, but also because they suck up a lot of room. They suck up when it comes to, deference amongst other players. They're deferential to the, PA is, you know, the Fatah dominated PA is representing us, and they, you know, they get to decide where resources that are, you know, geared towards Palestinian initiative, they suck up most of those resources. So, you know, it also, so they are a part of the problem, but, you know, we have to decide, where is it that we want to invest our energy? Just pointing out that they're a problem, fine, they are. Now we have to think strategically to overcome that problem. Do you want to take over what they've tried to do on the inside in the PLO, expose its bankruptcy? Do you want to create the alternative on the outside? And I think a lot of people have a lot of ideas, and there are no shortage of Palestinian activists and people who are working and around the clock and burnt out, but it hasn't congealed.
I think for a lot of Palestinians, I think we take a bigger picture of all Palestinians around the world. There are not as many that are mobilized that could be, and I think with different junctures of our history where there was a different organizing principle, maybe around armed resistance and revolutionary struggle. And so I think when we want to be able to appeal and to mobilize en masse and be able to say, okay, there was an evolution from one democratic secular state to a two-state solution. Now we're pivoting potentially to something else. This might be a post-nationalist understanding of freedom, justice, equality, and rights for all. How is that something that they can reckon with, and something that they say, okay, I think there needs to be an acceptance of something that hasn't been internalized for a long time.
This is all really, right? We're just having this conversation, and we're, you know, chipping away at the surface of so many critical conversations that we should have. I want to emphasize something, and I got this a lot as I, you know, shared my work with different audiences across the globe. There's a tension that comes up for Palestinians. And I remember it vividly in Australia, where a woman from East Jerusalem was crying in the audience because for her, it's like life and death. And for so many Palestinians, it is life and death, right? Literally, life and death. And so on the one hand, we have these acute conditions that produce and limit our even viability of survival, just having life, right? Basic life, not even just like social death. And then on the other hand, we have these grand meta conversations about the future and politics and so on and so forth. So one way to reconcile that is to think about, we have room to both be in resistance to something that is awful, as well as room to be proactive and have long-term strategies, you know, at least I would say 5-decade strategies of what it is that we want to build. The resistance part is what we've mastered and what we're good at and what we could do more of right now, which is resistance is basically in the form of the negation of what exists, highlighting its unjustness, holding Israel to account, condemning, you know, demonstrating Israel's illegitimacy on so many fronts, affirming a racist structure, right? All of that in the negative, isolating it, creating coalitions that are basically in support of Palestinian freedom. And we need a lot more of it, right? We need a lot more of it. That's a resistance kind of front. And that's all the things that we should continue to do and support. And so I don't want to paralyze anybody listening to this by overcomplicating what should otherwise be simple. These are life and death situations. Resistance is absolutely critical and at the core of everything that we do, which leaves to question and leaves as an imperative, okay, we'll resist. We have to, right? It's a defensive posture in order to survive. What is our offensive strategy? Resistance is our defensive strategy. And so what is our offensive strategy? And that's the space where we have room, right? And I think, you know, could help us at least to distinguish those things, our defensive versus offensive postures, and to create room for the offensive, you know, to distinguish them, to develop different strategies for them.
I guess my question was, how much can you decouple nationalism from our offensive strategy? I mean, that's the essence of the question, because it's about mass appeal, right? It's about who am I drawing in? who are we resisting to where? And I think that's a very common question still with people who are still fighting for life and death. Where am I going? Yeah, now I'm going to the checkpoint every week to go throw stones, but in aspiration of what? And those are still conversations happening. And so if you come and talk to someone and say, well, okay, well, it is a post-nationalist, progressive, it's about decolonization and equality, etc. I think there's something missing, and I fail to understand it. I don't know what it is, and I think a lot of people.
This is hard for a lot of people, right? We can condemn I wouldn't condemn nationalism outright. There's benefits to nationalism.
Yeah, I'm not either. It's just it's where we fit alongside a progressive movement, right?
Right, but if you stop at nationalism, that's the problem, right? But using nationalism as a tactic in organizing ourselves, I don't think is a problem, right? It's part of our, it is part of our existence. We have to be. I am Palestinian. I am not merely an Arab, right? I am distinctly Palestinian. That is a nationalist affirmation of who I am as a nation, right? Yeah. I belong to this particular nation connected to this land. Now, I don't want to decouple that from my offensive strategy. That's actually how I want to organize. That's actually who I want to organize with and on whose behalf I want to organize for. But not just them. Not just. And so how do you mobilize nationalism for a lot of good without, and there's a lot of negative that comes with it, how do you do that? And so that's where the self-reflexive, and even where we started in this conversation on gender within our communities, right? Gender within our national struggle, racism within our national struggle, classism, those things, we can both be part of something with an expansive horizon of who our community is and who we belong to, right? We can do it. We can do it. But it requires, both being inward looking amongst ourselves and self-critical, and I had a great experience last summer with Sandra Tamari at the Ramallah Convention in Washington, D.C., where I thought, I went into that space. I was like, this isn't going to go well. They want me to talk, but I have a lot of critical things to say to my, to my people. My people, that's nationalist, right? I have critical things to say to my people and to hold us to account. And the message that I had was all the recent strides that have been made in the United States, from a presidential candidate who was able to advocate for the ending of the siege on Gaza, to 8 out of 10 Democratic candidates boycotting the AIPAC, conference, to 2 members of Congress supporting BDS. All of those have been victories based on progressive allies in the movement. Therefore, which means, progressive allies, which means our Black Palestinian solidarity, our Black, the Palestinian indigenous solidarity has been in spaces for, gender justice and so on and so forth. And so looking back now at our Palestinian community and saying, what does that mean about us and where we belong and who are our allies and what that makes imperative upon us within our own communities to struggle against, right? And I expected revolt in that conversation of like, you know what I mean? There's a lot of that, respectability politics. There was so much positive affirmation. And so it's generational. It's what we can do. We don't have to, I don't think we have to sacrifice our Palestinian national identities.
No, so that's not, I don't think that's what I meant. I think the nationalism is more tied to, I think, the state structure. And I think there's usually a conflation of that with Oslo and what it was going to produce, rather than I am Palestinian and nationally I identify as such, right? I think that's the distinction I want to make. But yeah, no, I hear everything you say, and it's everything I believe in personally. It's just, I think, post the nation within a state and what we've been, the political project that we've undertaken for the last 30 years is how to move beyond that in a way that people can resonate with, believe in, and mobilize in all parts of the world, here in refugee camps, etc. And I think that's the organizing principle sometimes we're looking for. And I guess what I was exploring is how much is that tied to progressive ideas and values, and
I think here's something that I'm going to share that I've shared before, which is part of where we find ourselves as Palestinian, if the state is in fact obsolete and that's no longer a possibility as a way forward for our future and our liberation, what does that mean for us? And so we're not alone in having to answer that question. For a lot of communities, the state is not the answer. Kurdish communities, right, that's not necessarily the answer. Black communities in the United States, at some point, establishing, seating and establishing a Black, state, and as a nationalist answer was, but is no longer. So, political sovereignty has shown its limits and its limited horizons. So we're not alone in having to figure out, how do we get free? How do we become free outside of the only model of freedom necessarily that we've known, which is these nation state structures of freedom that have defined it for us? The answer to that question is so amorphous and so, it's not, you can't hold on to it, that it's precisely why the alternative becomes so much easier. And it's why the right is so successful, because they're offering easy answers. And we're offering these complicated answers. So again, I would say that it's a both and framework, where we're both doing the short-term resistance work on the defensive to get rid of what we absolutely don't want, and then having to envision the offensive framework of building what it is that we really want. Even thinking, as a basic example, in 1967, Israel wanted to annex the West Bank and Gaza. They didn't. It didn't, because it didn't want to annex the population. It would have disrupted its Jewish demographic majority. So instead, it has basically been on course of steadily removing Palestinians, concentrating them into smaller and smaller areas, and then annexing the lands that they've been removed from. That project has taken them, 53 years? And the only thing I would say is, we can build long-term projects. We can build long-term projects and there aren't easy answers. And part of the, and we're seeing people develop, we see a lot of communities who have been abandoned, create those answers. We saw Palestinians in the course of the Intifada of creating alternative schools, of creating alternative networks, of food distribution, alternative economies, actually create that. So much of what we're looking for is also is in our mutual existence. How do we create that amongst one another? We're seeing Palestinians do that really well in responding to COVID-19, of not relying necessarily on the state, but of also providing for one another. All of this has been, we have to think, we have to create that alternative amongst ourselves and within our communities that become the seeds to replicate on a mass scale of what it is that we're trying to do, right?
So I guess on those words of hope and, I think, wisdom, what an amazing and fruitful and rich conversation.
What a confusing, amorphous, non-definitive, but this is precisely it.
Yeah.
This is the process. If we knew the answers, we'd be pursuing them. If there was a blueprint, right?
Yeah, and I think what's really important, Noura, and what I was trying to always get at, was a lot of people that might be interested in Palestine, want to learn more, don't know a lot of these conversations, don't know a lot of these subjects, and don't know how we talk about them amongst ourselves. And I think what we wanted to try to do is give them a window to a very small part of it. We can sit and talk about these things for hours. Okay.
So one of the last things I want to say is, I've always found value. Oftentimes we look for answers, but answers aren't available. But if you look at specific things, you find answers organically emerge from that. So what do I mean? Right? What do I mean? There isn't a magic recipe in order to resolve, our condition of unfreedom. But there are so many efforts amongst Palestinians everywhere doing resistance work and building those futures, from planting, seeds that have been discontinued, from, the trees, creating films, to, marches, organizing, defense work. So one thing I've always wanted to see is to actually create a platform where we can just highlight all these initiatives. What is everyone doing? Because everyone's doing something. What is everyone doing, right? What are all these initiatives? Who are all of our Palestinian heroes everywhere, right, that are doing this work? Let's highlight them. Let's create a platform where they can see one another. In the course, I think that that is so inspiring. In the course of being able to look around and say, oh my God, look at all of these initiatives, from the Naqab to cultural, renaissance amongst Palestinians in Haifa, to initiatives in Gaza of, amongst Palestinian writers, and Dardashe, amongst people who are protesting, the Palestinian protests against patriarchy, right? Why don't we create a platform?
Yeah.
Why don't we create a platform? And all it could be, just a place, a map. It could be a program, a television program. It could be your program, right? Which corresponds to, a visual mapping. And then that, right? Instead of wanting to create an umbrella, instead it's that, multitude of initiatives that then demands an umbrella, right? So instead of creating a space and inviting everybody to come into it, why don't we, see what all the work that's being done, and then decide what's the best way to create a space that accommodates it, right?
Yeah.
So oftentimes at the loss for answers, instead of having to look for answers, start from what we have, and we have a lot. And I would love to do that, and I would love, to do that with others who want to do that work on a platform.
Absolutely.
And create that mapping.
Sounds like a plan, and it's a platform to inspire as well. I think sometimes we lose a bit of hope, and I think it's all the good that can bring us back and inspire us to keep moving forward. Noura, I want to thank you so much. It's been such a beautiful conversation. I enjoyed all of it. And is there anything you want to, is there something you're working on, or something that's coming that you want to refer to? Maybe your book, give it a shout.
So one of the things we didn't talk about the future, and what was really interesting, for a lot of people who did, engage with me on the book, where I ended, we're struggling, and we're in this circular space, which is, if there isn't a state and we've been left out of the promise of a state, then what next, and how do we build towards it? And some of the questions that I ask are, what would an anti-racist struggle look like? Not necessarily just an anti-Zionist struggle, but one that, goes beyond the settler native binary to identify how would we, if our struggle was against racism and racial capitalism, what would that look like? And so part of my search for those answers are looking at transnational social movements between Palestinians and other groups. And what indications do we have in the course of that activist work that are offering insights and answers about those futures? So the work that, I'm doing research on Black Palestinian solidarity ongoing, because I think that activists are answering that question and are answering it in practice, of looking at, indigenous Palestinian, North American indigenous and Palestinian indigenous solidarity, and looking at Palestinians who traveled to the Mauna Kea in Hawaii, protesting, the takeover of this sacred mountaintop for the Kanaka Maoli people in order to build a telescope in the name of science, right? What do we learn from these activist experiences? What insights do they tell us about possibilities for the future and of our survival, right? It would be akin to thinking about maroonage, and spaces of freedom, even in the shadow of significant and oppressive and very violent unfreedom. What do those spaces look like, and how do they signal for us alternatives?
Amazing. When can we expect that work? Is it something you're developing, or?
It's incremental. So I've got it coming out, it's incremental and it's ongoing. I have one article coming out in June 2020 on Black Palestinian solidarity, where in interviews with activists who were part of the Ferguson Gaza renewal in 2014, in the course of just talking to those activists, I discovered, that I discovered something really interesting about basically how US white supremacy is international.
Mm.
And that the international framework of Black Palestinian solidarity isn't just offered from Palestine, but is offered from North America, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And what it looks like for Palestinians in North America, and what it looks like for Palestinians in North America who are in solidarity, what that means to be in solidarity with Black freedom, right? And what it makes incumbent upon us to think about. So that's one article
Looking
coming
forward.
out.
Yeah. And where can people get your book?
You can get it online. You can get it at Stanford University Press. It's now coming out in paperback. But yeah, it's available online. I would recommend the press. It's also available at different bookstores. So
Awesome.
you can get it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Noura.
Thank you, Salim. That was fun.
Yes, it
Yeah, we
was.
get off. Yeah.